If there is one lesson this war has taught the world, it is that Ukraine does not fold when the odds turn brutal. It does not retreat just because the challenge looks too big, the distance too far, or the target too heavily protected. Again and again, Ukraine has stepped into situations that were supposed to break it, and instead of collapsing, it has rewritten the rules of what was thought possible. That is exactly what happened in late March 2026, when Kyiv pulled off a sequence of strikes so bold, so deep, and so economically damaging that even Russia could not bring itself to admit what had actually happened. In the space of just a few days, Ukraine reached almost 1,000 kilometers beyond its own borders and hit three major pieces of Russian oil infrastructure in succession, setting ports and refinery assets on fire, disrupting operations, exposing the fragility of Russia's air defenses, and sending a message that the Kremlin's economic arteries are no longer safe, no matter how far from the battlefield they appear to be. The first blow came on March 23rd, when Ukrainian drones struck the port of Primorsk, Russia's main oil export port on the Baltic Sea. This was not some secondary logistics node or symbolic outpost. Primorsk is one of the most important oil shipping hubs in Russia, located in the Leningrad region, relatively close to St. Petersburg and not far from the Finnish border. It serves as a major outlet for crude oil and petroleum products flowing out of Russia, and it has long been associated with the Kremlin's so-called shadow fleet, the privately owned tankers used to transport sanctioned Russian oil around the world while skirting restrictions and generating enormous sums of revenue for Moscow. Primorsk is also the endpoint of the Baltic pipeline system and is capable of handling roughly 1 million barrels per day. That alone makes it strategically vital, but the scale of storage at the site makes it even more significant. The port contains 18 large reservoirs, each capable of holding up to 50,000 tons. At any given time, huge quantities of crude and petroleum products are sitting there, waiting to be loaded, processed, or moved onward. In plain terms, this is one of the beating hearts of Russia's oil export machine. That is exactly why Ukraine targeted it. Kyiv has been steadily escalating its campaign against Russia's oil infrastructure, understanding that every successful hit does more than create a dramatic fireball. It cuts into storage, throughput, exports, insurance confidence, repair budgets, and ultimately the cash flow that helps fund the Russian war effort. Ukraine had already hit Primorsk once before, back in September 2025, temporarily forcing a halt in operations. But the March 2026 strike was bigger, bolder, and far more consequential. Residents in the area reported explosions during the night, and Leningrad Region Governor Alexander Drozdenko was forced to confirm that at least one fuel storage tank had been damaged and ignited. But as often happens in Russia after these kinds of attacks, the initial official acknowledgement turned out to be far smaller than the damage visible afterward. Satellite imagery in the days that followed indicated that the destruction was not limited to a single tank. At least 8 were confirmed damaged, and fires spread across the site as crews struggled for days to contain the inferno. Images and videos from the area showed flames rising into the air and thick black smoke towering over the port, a visual reminder that one of Russia's key export arteries had just been violently interrupted. What made the strike even more humiliating for Moscow was the scale of the defensive effort that failed to stop it. Russian air defenses reportedly intercepted more than 60 Ukrainian attack drones that same night. On paper, the Kremlin could point to those numbers and claim a successful defense. But that narrative collapses the moment you look at the actual outcome. Enough drones got through to hit one of Russia's most critical oil facilities, hundreds of miles from Ukraine, in a region Russia insists is heavily protected. In other words, Russia could boast about dozens of intercepts, but it still failed at the one thing that mattered: keeping the target safe. That alone should have been enough to alarm the Kremlin. But what happened next made it far worse. Just 2 days later, on March 25th, Ukraine struck again, this time targeting the port of U.S. Teluga in the northwestern Leningrad region. Once again, the target was hundreds of miles away from Ukraine's border, and once again it was anything but random. U.S. Teluga is one of the most important energy and industrial ports in Russia. It can reportedly process around 700,000 barrels of oil per day, and its value extends far beyond crude exports. The port is also tied to a massive energy processing complex capable of handling up to 45 billion cubic meters of natural gas, while producing millions of tons of liquefied natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas every year. This is exactly the kind of location Ukraine has increasingly focused on: high-value, energy-linked infrastructure whose disruption causes economic pain far beyond the immediate site of impact. And it was not the first time U.S. Teluga had come under Ukrainian attack. Kyiv had already struck it in January 2024, and again later that year in August. That means the March 2026 operation marked the third successful strike on this facility, turning what had already been a recurring vulnerability into a full-blown strategic embarrassment for Russia. Reports from local residents described at least 10 separate explosions in the area, followed by a major fire response as flames spread across the site. Governor Drozdenko once again acknowledged the attack and once again sought to minimize the visible consequences. But images shared online and subsequent analysis told a very different story. Massive fires were seen burning across sections of the facility, with dark smoke covering the skyline. Intelligence analysts later assessed that 3 oil tankers were damaged, along with storage tanks, 3 berths, and facilities connected to the Russian energy company Novatek. The terminal had to be sealed off and shut down for several days, and even after operations resumed, it reportedly functioned well below peak capacity. Specialists estimated that repairs would take weeks, which is a devastating prospect for a site of that scale. Ports like U.S. Teluga do not need to be fully destroyed to inflict serious damage on the Russian economy. Even short interruptions can disrupt shipping schedules, delay exports, trigger losses in storage and processing, and increase uncertainty across the entire supply chain. By this point, Ukraine had already done something remarkable. In the space of just 2 attacks, it had penetrated deep into Russian territory and ignited 2 major energy export locations in one of the country's most strategically important regions. These were not isolated anomalies. They were coordinated demonstrations that Russia's depth, distance, and supposed defensive sophistication were not enough to keep its infrastructure secure. But Ukraine was still not finished. On the night of March 26th, Ukrainian drone units launched yet another strike, once again into the Leningrad region, and this time their target was the Karishi Petroleum Organic Synthesis Refinery, better known as the Kyiv Refinery. This facility is one of the giants of Russia's refining sector. Owned by one of the country's largest energy firms, it can process up to 20 million tons of oil annually, making it the second largest refinery in Russia by processing capacity. Its role is not limited to basic fuel production. It also produces a range of petrochemicals used domestically and sold abroad, which makes it a direct contributor to the Kremlin's wartime revenue stream. If Ukraine's strategy is to slowly tighten the economic pressure on Moscow and make the war harder and harder to sustain, then a site like Kyiv is exactly the kind of target that matters. According to reports, more than 20 Ukrainian drones made it to the area and struck critical infrastructure. Once again, Governor Drozdenko confirmed that an attack had taken place, though his description was notably vague, referring only to damage in an unspecified industrial zone. But the wider information picture once again told a much harsher story. Eyewitnesses reported seeing intense fires and thick smoke over the refinery, suggesting that fuel storage or associated infrastructure had been ignited. Satellite imagery later showed signs consistent with a fire at the site. Taken together, the 3 strikes formed one of the most consequential Ukrainian deep strike sequences of the war. 3 major energy-linked targets in just a few days, all hit successfully, all located far from the front line, and all in a region Russia would have once described as secure. That is what made the Russian reaction so revealing. Instead of simply acknowledging the obvious, Russian sources began claiming that Ukraine had somehow cheated. Official narratives started circulating that Kyiv could not possibly have carried out these attacks alone by flying drones directly through Russian airspace. According to that version of events, Ukraine must have worked with NATO states, especially Poland and the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The claim was that the drones flew west from Ukraine into Poland, then north through Lithuania and across the Baltic region, before approaching the Leningrad targets from around the Gulf of Finland area. It was, in effect, an attempt to rewrite geography in order to protect Russian pride. Because the alternative explanation was simply too humiliating for the Kremlin to admit, that Ukrainian drones had flown hundreds of miles through Russian-controlled airspace, slipped past multiple warning and defense layers, and ignited some of the most important infrastructure in Russia's northwest. The reason that explanation was so difficult for Moscow to accept is obvious. Russia has spent years cultivating the image of a military superpower with nearly impenetrable territory and some of the best air defense systems in the world. The entire myth of Russian strategic depth rests on the idea that the state can detect threats early, repel them effectively, and keep vital infrastructure protected. Ukraine has spent the course of this war tearing holes in that myth. Every successful long-range strike inside Russia does more than cause physical damage. It dismantles the propaganda architecture that says Moscow is untouchable. And when Ukraine hit 3 Leningrad region energy targets in such quick succession, that myth took another major blow. The Russian story became even harder to sustain once open-source investigators started looking at the evidence. Soon after the attacks, Russian-linked sources circulated images supposedly showing the route the drones must have taken through NATO territory. Those claims were then publicly dismantled by the open-source intelligence analyst Drone Bomber on X. In a March 26th post, Drone Bomber argued that the NATO route theory made no sense and pointed instead to the pattern of Russian air alerts that appeared on the exact nights of the strikes. One of the strongest pieces of evidence was simple. Every time Ukrainian drones are detected over Russian territory, local authorities in nearby regions usually trigger alerts. On March 23rd, 25, and 26, alerts were recorded in multiple Russian regions situated between Ukraine and the Leningrad area. Maps showed a chain of warnings appearing one after another in places such as Bryansk, Smolensk, and onward, outlining a clear corridor through Russian airspace toward Primorsk, U.S. Teluga, and Kiev. In other words, the path was visible in Russia's own defensive behavior. Drone Bomber also pointed out that on all 3 dates, Russian officials themselves admitted to shooting down large numbers of Ukrainian drones. On March 23rd, Governor Drozdenko said more than 50 drones were intercepted. On March 25th, Russian sources claimed 33 more had been shot down. On March 26th, they said another 21 drones were destroyed. Those figures, rather than proving the NATO theory, actually undermine it. If Russia itself was claiming repeated drone interceptions across the same time frame that the Leningrad strikes occurred, it was effectively acknowledging that Ukrainian UAVs were indeed crossing Russian territory. Drone Bomber did leave open the possibility that some drones may have skirted near the western edge of Belarus rather than relying exclusively on a pure Russian corridor, but the overall picture remained devastatingly clear. Russia's own alerts, its own interception claims, and the timing of the attacks all pointed to the same conclusion. The drones flew through Russian airspace, and the Kremlin failed to stop them. As Drone Bomber summed it up, the picture was almost absurd. Alerts across the country, defenses active at full intensity, claims of hundreds shot down, and yet propaganda still insisting the drones somehow never flew over Russia. Russia's attempt to blame NATO states also triggered pushback from the Baltic region. Moscow tried to suggest that the Baltic countries had allowed their airspace or territory to be used in support of Ukrainian attacks. That line was directly countered by the Latvian Ministry of Defense, which issued a clear statement emphasizing that Latvia, as well as Lithuania and Estonia, had no involvement in the planning or execution of Ukraine's counterattacks on Russian infrastructure. More importantly, the Latvian side framed Russia's narrative for what it was, a sign of weakness and a deliberate attempt to distract from its own inability to defend key infrastructure on the Baltic coast. Latvian officials also warned that such claims fit into a broader Russian information warfare pattern aimed at discrediting NATO, dividing society, undermining trust in institutions, and weakening support for Ukraine. In other words, the Kremlin was not merely lying to save face. It was also trying to exploit the moment politically. From the Ukrainian perspective, however, the significance of these strikes goes much deeper than one propaganda battle. This was a strategic success story and another example of Kyiv doing what so many said it could not do. That has, in many ways, been the defining pattern of this war. At the beginning, Ukraine was treated by many observers as the obvious underdog, badly outmatched in manpower, equipment, resources, and conventional military strength. Russia had the larger army, the larger industrial base, more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery, and years of great power messaging behind it. There were genuine fears in the early period of the invasion that Kiev might fall quickly and that Ukraine's defenses would collapse under the sheer weight of Russian force. But that is not what happened. Ukraine held. It adapted. It counterpunched. It survived the phase when survival itself looked uncertain, and then it began proving, over and over again, that Russian strength was neither as overwhelming nor as untouchable as many assumed. These deep strikes fit perfectly into that broader pattern. What began as occasional blows against Russian infrastructure has evolved into something far more systematic. Through 2025 and into 2026, Ukraine steadily increased the frequency, range, and impact of its attacks inside Russian territory. It is no longer merely striking back here and there. It is developing the demonstrated ability to hit high-value targets repeatedly, on consecutive nights, and in regions that lie far beyond what Russia once believed Ukraine could threaten. That evolution matters because it changes the strategic map. A war that once looked concentrated near the front line now increasingly reaches into Russia's own economic interior. The attacks did not stop with the Leningrad region sequence either. Only a few days after the Kiev strike, on March 30th, Ukraine reportedly hit Russia again. Explosions were reported in the city of Tolyatti in the Samara region, where local residents described at least 5 blasts around 5 a.m., followed by smoke and fires at a major chemical plant. The same night, reports also emerged of a drone strike on the Alchevsk metallurgical plant in occupied Luhansk, a facility once associated with civilian metallurgy but repurposed by Russian forces for military-related production. A major fire was reported there as well. These follow-on strikes reinforced the central message of the late March campaign. Ukraine is not easing pressure. It is increasing it. For Russia, the implications are painful and growing more serious with time. Every successful strike on an oil terminal, storage tank, refinery, chemical site, or industrial facility exposes yet another gap in Russian defensive coverage. It shows that the country's air defenses, despite years of grand claims, are still unable to fully stop Ukraine's expanding drone campaign. And this matters in a very material sense. Yes, fires can be extinguished. Damaged assets can be repaired. Some operations can resume. But none of that erases the losses. Every time a tanker burns, every time a storage tank erupts, every time a port closes for even a few days, Russia loses export volume, processing capacity, handling efficiency, and revenue. In 2025, Primorsk reportedly exported almost 17 million tons of petroleum products. U.S. Teluga handled nearly 33 million tons. Those are vast figures, and they help explain why even temporary disruption matters so much. When a strike forces these facilities to cease or reduce operations, oil stops moving. Tankers stop loading. Storage turns into fuel for fires instead of money for the state. Even when basic operations are restored, the effects linger. Damaged berths, damaged tanks, damaged production units, heightened security procedures, repair schedules, insurance concerns, shipping delays, and reduced throughput all create drag on the system. And Russia is not facing these problems in peacetime. It is trying to wage a massive, costly war while also absorbing these disruptions. With less money coming in, the pressure intensifies across the board. Military salaries, procurement, production, maintenance, compensation, logistics, and all the other expenses of a long war become harder to sustain. There is also the internal energy balance to consider. Russia depends on being able to both export fuel for cash and retain enough for domestic and military requirements. When infrastructure is repeatedly struck and oil burns instead of being stored, refined, or shipped, that balancing act becomes more difficult. That is precisely why Ukraine keeps targeting this sector. The objective is not random destruction. It is strategic exhaustion. Kiev wants to make the war increasingly unsustainable for Russia, to force the Kremlin into a position where the costs of continuing outweigh the value of persisting. Every major fire at a port or refinery is part of that larger pressure campaign. Every successful long-range strike tells Moscow that time is no longer automatically on its side. And every new failure of Russian air defenses adds another crack to the image of strength the Kremlin depends on, both domestically and internationally. So when you step back and look at what happened in late March 2026, the picture is extraordinary. Ukraine reached deep into one of Russia's most important energy regions and struck Primorsk, U.S. Teluga, and Kyiv in rapid succession. It exposed the vulnerability of the Shadow Fleet export system, damaged tankers and storage, disrupted port operations, set refinery infrastructure ablaze, and forced Russia into a propaganda scramble so desperate that it tried to blame NATO countries rather than admit the truth. It also reinforced a much bigger reality. This war is no longer one in which Russia can safely assume that distance equals security. Ukraine has proven that it can reach, hit, and burn some of the Kremlin's most valuable economic assets even when they sit hundreds of miles beyond the front line. And that is why these strikes matter so much. They are not just spectacular operations. They are part of a systematic campaign to tear into the foundations of Russia's war economy piece by piece. If Ukraine can keep doing this, if it can keep forcing shutdowns, igniting storage tanks, disrupting exports, raising repair costs, and humiliating Russian defenses, then the pressure on Moscow will only intensify. The longer that pressure continues, the harder it becomes for the Kremlin to sustain the war on the same terms. And that, ultimately, is the real significance of these attacks. Ukraine is not only surviving, it is steadily making the war more painful, more expensive, and more strategically unstable for Russia with every passing month. If Moscow believed geography alone could shield its most valuable infrastructure, late March 2026 destroyed that illusion. Ukraine crossed the distance. It beat the defenses. It hit the targets. And it did it 3 times in a row. Then, when Russia tried to hide behind excuses, the evidence itself turned against the Kremlin. That is the deeper humiliation here. The damage is serious. The fires are real. The disruption is costly. But perhaps worst of all for Russia, the myth is fading too. The myth of control. The myth of invulnerability. The myth that Ukraine would eventually run out of ways to hit back. It has not. And if these strikes are any indication, it is only getting better at setting the Kremlin's most valuable assets on fire. For more sharp military analysis and deep strategic breakdowns like this, stay with Strategic Horizon Watch.